Welcome all, and good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome, and thanks for joining this IAS educational webinar entitled HIV and TB co-infections, the latest updates and innovations. My name is Kenneth Ngure. I'm an IAS Governing Council member from Africa, and I'm also the Dean School of Public Health, Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology. The purpose of this IAS educational fund is to galvanize the scientific response, build a global solidarity, and enhance human dignity for all those living and affected by HIV. The mission is to convene leading minds and to accelerate scientific discovery. We advocate for evidence-based and stigma-free policies and educate change makers to ensure the global HIV response follows the science and puts people first. Last 24th of March, on World TB Day, the Journal of International AIDS Society launched a viewpoint entitled New Tricks for a No Dog, Opportunities for Better Tuberculosis Control. And I hope many of you have seen it, and we are hoping that you'll also be able to read it. Every year, 10 million people fall ill with tuberculosis. Despite being a preventable and curable disease, 1.5 million people die from TB each year. TB is the leading cause of death of people with HIV and a major contributor to antimicrobial resistance. We are therefore very happy to be here to have an opportunity to learn and exchange further with you on this important topic that IAS members wanted to hear about. Before I pass the floor to Sin Wasman, IAS would like to thank our donors, that is Viv Healthcare and Gilead Sciences, for making these very important webinars possible. I will therefore now pass over the floor to today's webinar moderator, Dr. Sin Westman. Sin, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Kenneth. Hello, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining. I think this webinar comes at a really critical time because of enormous developments in the field of tuberculosis and in HIV-associated tuberculosis, and I'm very excited to be able to moderate it today. My name is Sean Wasserman. I am an infectious diseases physician based at the University of Cape Town in South Africa and a TB researcher. And there really have been advances across all areas of TB care, from discovery and introduction of new and repurposed drugs, only 4 years ago, abandoning of injectable agents for the treatment of drug-resistant TB. We now have safe and what we think are effective shorter regimens for both drug-sensitive and drug-resistant TB. There are new developments in the management of latent tuberculosis infection and an ongoing and an increasing recognition of the importance of subclinical TB for TB control. We have much improved management of HIV-associated tuberculosis and introduction of transformative diagnostics. And I think very importantly, and it's reflected in the presenters today, there's really an unprecedented engagement by community, civil societies, governments, and recognition of the importance of tuberculosis on health, which is really essential for implementation and translation of these new tools that have come about from scientific advances, really ultimately into improving people's lives. But despite this, and as advances continue, there are significant challenges that we still need to address, new ones that emerge as we get scientific progress. And we need to deal with these in order to achieve the ambitious NTB targets. And so I think the reason why this webinar is so important is because it addresses key issues in the field that, as Kenneth says, have been identified by IAS members. And I think the talks are going to be very relevant to IAS members. The seminar is going to cover things ranging from updates on treatment advances and evidence-based guidelines for drug-resistant TB, challenges and progress for procurement of new drugs, specifically pretominid, and community engagement interventions that will support HIV TB care. So I'm really excited to get started. But before we start, I just need to tell you about some housekeeping rules for the webinar. It looks like a number of you already know them because you're already very active in the chat, which is great. But for new people, just to say that all participants are going to be muted for the duration of the webinar, so you won't be able to speak. and that's just because of the number of participants, but you will be able to engage very actively, and we strongly encourage engagement. There's going to be a large chunk of planned time at the end of the presentations for interaction with the speakers via the Q&A box, which you can see on the bottom of your screen, and that's where you should ask your questions. And you can pose broad questions, or you can pose questions to specific speakers by mentioning their names and just type your question. Then do that throughout the webinar. Don't wait until the end and we'll pick them up. You'll also notice that there's a thumbs up symbol when someone asks a question in the Q&A box. If you have a similar question and you don't want to repeat it, or if you think the question is important, please use that symbol so that we can prioritize the discussion and shape the discussion around what you want to hear. You already are using the chat box, which is separate to the Q&A, and the chat box is really just to raise any kind of technical issues that you're having with the webinar as we go along, but also to send greetings and tell us which country you're from, which is very important for IAS. So those are the rules, and without further delay, I would really like to get into the webinar and just show you what we're going to be covering today. So we've got 4 excellent speakers presenting on diverse issues which are linked and really important. So the first, and I'll introduce them in detail before they each speak, but here they are. Fuad Mirzayev, who is the director of the WHO Global TB Program, and he's based in Geneva. Hema Srinivasan, who is the Chief Access Officer for MedAccess, and she's based in the UK. Asna Ashesh, who is an MDR TB survivor, public health professional, lawyer, member of the RGLC, SEA, WHO, and a fellow from SATB from India. And finally, Wame Jalo, who is Vice President of International Programs, Population Media Center, based in Botswana. So I think this is very exciting. We're not going to delay any further, and we're going to move straight into our first presentation, which is going to be given by Fuad. And if we can just bring up those slides, and I'll start to introduce Fuad Mirzayev in more detail. So he's probably known to a lot of you. He leads the treatment team of the World Health Organization Global TB Program, and that is the unit for TB prevention, diagnosis, treatment, care, and innovation. He's been at the WHO for a long time, joining in 2004. His main areas of work were drug-resistant tuberculosis, access to second-line TB medicines, coordination of multi-country projects to expand access to innovate TB diagnostics, new TB medicines, and policy development on TB infection prevention and control, and treatment of drug-resistant TB. Before joining the WHO, he worked for the International Committee of the Red Cross. So very accomplished and the exact right person to present this topic, which is a 2022 update on WHO's consolidated guidelines on TB and focusing on drug-resistant TB treatment. So Fuad, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean. I hope you can hear me, and also you can see my slide, the full screen.
Looks good. We can hear you.
Very good. Just before I start, on the top slide, it was kind of unexpected promotion. I'm not the director of the Global TB Program. I am a team lead of the drug-resistant TB and TB treatment team. So just to make that correction. But yes, thank you for that small mistake on the top slide. Just to say hello, everyone, and again, thank you for IAS to inviting me to speak at this webinar. What I will try to cover today in this small amount of time, 10 minutes, is just to give you some key updates of the WHO guidance on the treatment of drug-resistant tuberculosis. So let me just go directly into that, and I hope that slides are moving. Great. So just to say at the beginning that WHO Global TB Program has a long history of developing guidelines on TB care and treatment since the early 90s. There were several of the guidelines and operational handbooks that have been updated throughout the years, and many of them got consolidated and updated in 2022, last year. So including the drug-resistant TB guidelines. Just before speaking and focusing on drug-resistant TB guidelines update, I just want to add a bit of perspective of all the updates and publications that were released by the WHO Global TB Program in 2022. There were guidelines on drug-susceptible TB and the handbook that that were released in 22 with some new recommendations for the treatment of drug-susceptible TB, some 4-month regimens for children and adults. The new TB care guidelines and the handbook have also been released in July 22, and finally, very towards at the end of the year in December 22, we released the updated and consolidated guidelines on drug-resistant TB. So before speaking about the key updates, let me just go quickly for your information on the pieces of evidence that provided a basis for these guidelines updates. We had several partners and countries generously sharing the data, which was really useful because that allowed us to do the guideline, to perform the guidelines review. One big piece of data that we utilized was the data from the multi-arm, multi-stage trial run by MSF in 3 countries, so-called TB Practical, that had the retained 1 investigational regimen in stage 2 and compared that to the standard of care regimens in all 3 countries. The other piece was the so-called Zinix trial run by the TB Alliance, and it was focused mainly on the different durations and dosing of linezolid within the BPAL regimen, and it didn't use any standard of care comparator. It was run in 4 countries, Georgia, Moldova, Russian Federation, and South Africa. The South Africa, I should say, has generously shared the countrywide data on 2 9-month regimens that allowed us the new recommendation expanding the 9-month regimen that I'll talk later, as well as many other countries and partners working in many different settings that shared the data. That was at least another 6 or 7 countries. There was this, of course, the data from South Africa, but also the fieldwork in multiple countries by Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, and also the cohorts from the NTB, so-called NTB project provided by MSF and Partners of Health. So I just wanted to acknowledge all these partners for the sharing of the data. The updated drug-resistant TB guidelines and the handbook were eventually released in December 22 after the guidelines development group meeting. And the main changes are in the chapters that I have highlighted in red on this slide. So let's go, let me go a little bit more into the details on these key updates. One of the first ones is the 6-month bedaquiline, pretomaniate, linezolid, and moxifloxacin regimen, BPAL-M, for treatment of MDR or rifampicin-resistant tuberculosis. So this is the recommendation. This novel 6-month BPAL-M or BPAL regimen, because it can use or drop moxifloxacin, that is now recommended by WHO for patients with multidrug-resistant TB or rifampicin-resistant tuberculosis, but also for patients with the pre-XDR TB according to the new definition, meaning those with additional resistance to fluoroquinolones. It is a conditional recommendations with a low certainty of evidence, and the remarks to the recommendation cover actually the patients that can be enrolled on this regimen. I'll talk about that more, but just wanted also to highlight that it is the regimen where linezolid dosage is 600 milligram. And this is the regimen that kind of positioned as a regimen of choice for most of the patients with drug-resistant TB. The patient selection is very much guided by the underlying data that we had for the review from these different studies that I mentioned earlier. And because of that, and also the presence of the very new medicine, the predominate in this regimen, the extrapolation to other groups was a little bit difficult. So that's why, of course, it's positioned for the people with, as I said, with MDR, with the rifampicin-resistant TB, but also those with additional resistance to quinolones, so-called pre-XDR TB, according to the new definition of WHO, and people with confirmed extrapulmonary TB and all forms of extrapulmonary except of the osteoarticular disseminated TB, but also TB meningitis, the 14 years and older. So unfortunately, it's not yet recommended to be used in children, since the underlying data included all patients with HIV or without. It is recommended regardless of HIV status, and of course, to protect this regimen, it is recommended that the previous exposure would not be longer than 1 month to the drug components of this regimen. It is also not recommended during pregnancy due to very limited evidence on the safety of predominate. But we hope that with time, some more evidence will be available. The other recommendation that has been updated is a recommendation of the 9-month all-oral regimen for multidrug-resistant or rifampicin-resistant TB. This 9-month regimen continues to be recommended to cover the limitations of the BPAL-M regimen, as it can be used in children. This regimen also became a little bit more flexible because it can have ethionamide be replaced by linezolid for even shorter duration of 2 months compared to ethionamide that is usually used for 4 months. So since this regimen consists of medicines that are fairly well known and have been used for many years, so this regimen can be used for many patients. The only fairly new medicine in this regimen is bedaquiline, and it has been recently recommended to be used in all age groups. So that really can cover all patients. And as I said, this variation of linezolid replacing ethionamide can, therefore, because of that, can be used with caution during pregnancy, since the previous version of the regimen with ethionamide was not recommended in during the pregnancy. So that regimen becomes more flexible, and just to note that it is also can be used in all patients regardless of their HIV status. Finally, the 18-month, again, all oral regimen for MDR and rifampicin-resistant tuberculosis. This is the regimen that also remains as one of the options, since this is the only option that can be individualized and used as a last resort kind of scenario where standard regimens cannot be used. The standardized regimens cannot be used or have failed. So this is the regimen that can be built according to the suggestions that we have for already many years in the guidelines, with the Group A, Group B, and Group C prioritized kind of steps for building this regimen. It is worth perhaps also to note that since in these guidelines and also in the guidelines for treatment of childhood tuberculosis, it was also highlighted the 2 new recommendations that expanded the use of bedaquiline that was limited at 6 years and up, and the use of delamanid that can be one of the medicines that can be selected to build this regimen that was previously limited at 3 years and above. So that regimen also becoming much more flexible. So in the updated handbook, we have also added a table that to help select the regimen and decide on which regimen to use in different situations, and that the table takes into consideration different factors like the susceptibility to quinolones, the extent of the pulmonary TB or the form TB, like pulmonary, extrapulmonary, and age. So that factors really kind of can help the clinicians to decide on the regimen. But overall, the paradigm of drug-resistant TB treatment looks kind of very much different after these December 22 guidelines, with BPAL-M, BPAL regimen being a regimen of choice, where the 9-month regimens with the 2 variations can be used if the BPAL-M regimen cannot, and also if there are certain limitations or the failure of the previous regimen, there is still a possibility of using the individualized 18-month, also all oral but longer regimens for certain patients. So that's the way that the MDR-TB regimen selection and the whole paradigm of treatment looks like after these guidelines. So in summary, I would say that the new and shorter treatment regimens for drug-resistant TB treatment, the BPAL-M and BPAL and the 9-month regimen, are now available for the majority of the patients. There is still a last resort individualized option of the longer, but also all oral 18-20-month regimens. It's the first time probably in the history of drug-resistant TB treatment that the regimens for MDR-TB and regimens for drug-susceptible TB can be of the same duration, basically around 6 months. Although for DSTB, we'll have now options that are even shorter. And it is still that we need to consider the results of drug susceptibility testing, the age of the patients, and a few other factors for the regimen selection. So that's brings me to the end of this quick presentation. There are many more details that please, if you have the questions, please ask. But there are many more details in both the guidelines and the handbook that we have available on WHO website on the site of the Global TB Program. So I'm closing here. Thank you, everyone, and just want with this last slide acknowledge of all the experts that participated in the guideline development groups and consultation meetings in the development of also the national TB programs, researchers, partners who shared the data for the guidelines updates, and also the members of the team that was directly involved in this development. So thank you very much, and happy to answer questions when the time comes during this webinar.
Thank you, Fuad. A really great high-level summary of the updated guidelines. I think very clear. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions, especially around implementation and operationalization, which people have an opportunity to ask. I already see that there are a number of questions in the Q&A, which is fantastic, and I encourage people to continue doing that. We're going to move quickly on to our next speaker because the discussion is going to take place at the end after all 4 speakers have given their presentations. Each presentation is 10 minutes long. And so the next speaker actually follows quite nicely from Fuad's presentation because the next speaker is Hema Srinivasan, who is the Chief Access Officer of MedAccess, where she leads a team of experts to envision and implement innovative financing partnerships with the aim of expanding access to health products and services in underserved communities. During her tenure at MedAccess, Hema and her team have negotiated 8 financial guarantees that have supported over $400 million of health product procurement and have reached over 90 countries to date. And Hema will be presenting today on lower priced alternative treatments for drug-resistant TB. So over to you.
Great, thanks, Sean. Can you hear me?
We can hear you and see your slides. Thanks.
Okay, great. So as Sean mentioned, the topic I'm presenting on today is market shaping to improve equitable access to drug-resistant TB treatment. I will cover the predominant pricing agreement that we announced a couple of months ago, but I thought it would be helpful before we get to that to reflect a bit on what market shaping is and how it's been used in the past to improve access to health products. So to start, what is market shaping? I think rather than exclusively consulting global health institutions and publications, I decided to pose the question to ChatGPT. And interestingly enough, it seems that we have a consensus definition across different global health institutions as well as OpenAI, that market shaping is the process or the tools that we use to actively influence and change the conditions of a market to generate greater value for people and for businesses. Obviously, groups like MedAccess, Unitaid, CHI, USAID that work quite actively in the market shaping space focus market shaping tools on improving access to health products and ultimately driving better health outcomes at scale. And over the last 10, 15 plus years, the global health community has created a wide variety of market shaping and innovative financing tools. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's a nice graphic that CHI produced a couple of years ago, which I think helps to illustrate that different market shaping instruments are relevant at different stages in the product life cycle. So obviously things like prizes or development, regulatory incentive grants make a lot more sense when we're trying to incentivize the development of a product, whereas things like product subsidies and volume guarantees are a lot more relevant when a product has already been commercialized and launched and we're thinking about scaling it up. I think for me, the really important thing to consider when we design and implement these market shaping solutions is to take a big step back to really think about the public health problem that we're trying to solve, to really analyze the barriers to access that exist, and think really, really carefully about whether market shaping solutions are suitable, whether they can add value. Once we answer that question, then we come to how do we design a market shaping partnership? And that involves quite a lot of consultation with market actors ranging from civil society to governments, to donors, to suppliers. And then I think when all of that is said and done, before we actually move forward in signing one of these agreements, it's important to think about other solutions that might be available. You know, what are some of the externalities or impacts of introducing a market shaping agreement? So we think quite carefully throughout the process about, you know, whether this is the right type of initiative for a particular market. And we've had a lot of success, I would say, in the past decade or so, implementing market shaping partnerships specifically to improve access to health products. I don't want to go through an exhaustive list, but just to help unpack this a little bit more and think about the kinds of problems that market shaping can help to solve, I thought it would be useful to talk through a couple of examples. So one is HIV viral load testing, which I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with from a public health perspective. From a market perspective, when CHI, PEPFAR, Unitaid, and others started to look at this space in 2018, they saw that viral load tests often weren't available when HIV patients needed them. And the big challenge is that there's a complex array of products and services that need to come together at the right time in order for a patient to get a viral load test result. So you need this big molecular diagnostic platform. You need ongoing service and maintenance of that platform. You need reagents and consumables to run the test, and you need trained lab workers and health workers. And most of the procurement at that time was happening in a really fragmented way, which resulted in poor transparency into pricing, just higher costs overall to deliver viral load tests, and high instrument downtime. So we approached suppliers to sort of talk about whether there could be a big shift in the supply and pricing construct for viral load testing. So could we ask suppliers to make sure that they're providing all of the products and services needed in order for a patient to get that result. So they take the responsibility for installing the instrument, providing the service and maintenance, providing reagents and consumables, and training of lab workers. And what we heard in response was, yes, we see how that can add value and reach a lot more people who need viral load testing, but it involves the supplier taking on quite a lot of risk and making a lot of investments without knowing if ultimately that will lead to reaching more people. So MedAccess, CHAI, and others negotiated a volume guarantee with a company called Hologic. And in exchange for that multi-year guarantee of orders, they provided a $12 ceiling price per patient result that's all inclusive, and has reached quite a number of people across 13 countries so far. 3HP is another interesting one. I think Fuad referenced it earlier. We've seen a lot of developments in TB preventive therapy in the last few years. So 3HP is a product that had 90% completion rates in studies versus 50% on the previous standard of care. And when Unitaid started looking at this market a few years ago, they saw access was limited for a number of reasons. So there was only one supplier of the product. It was suboptimal, singles rather than a fixed dose combination, and supply was significantly constrained. On top of that, the price point really exceeded the cost effectiveness threshold that procurers had calculated. So the market shaping intervention that was executed here is multi-pronged and took several years. So Unitaid, CHAI, Orem provided commercialization support to manufacturers to get generics producing fixed dose combination products. Orem spent a lot of time working with a number of governments on 3HP introduction, catalytic procurement. Civil society groups like TAG were quite helpful in improving awareness and education around this regimen. And MedAccess provided a volume guarantee to one of the suppliers to reduce the price further and extend production capacity to meet growing demand. So it kind of shows clearly how we have to take this kind of problems-oriented approach to designing a market-shaping solution, and it involves quite a lot of collaboration and partnership for these to be successful. Now, turning focus to TB treatment, as Fuad mentioned, this has been quite an active space. We have seen new innovations come to market for TB treatment in the last few years, which is really exciting. And just given the need, given that an estimated 1.6 million people died of TB in 2021, and it remains the leading cause of death in people living with HIV, market shaping groups within global health have a very clear focus on improving TB care. And we see a lot of opportunity to help to make more effective, shorter course TB treatment and prevention regimens widely available. And beyond that, we see new diagnostics coming to market, the potential for a new vaccine. So I think there's a lot of promise in using these types of tools for TB treatment. And as we just heard, in 2022, there was, in our view, from a market perspective, kind of a step change in the potential impact of BPAL and BPAL-M. So we had a number of conversations with suppliers over the last few years, talking about the potential to reduce pricing of newer drugs like protominid and bedaquiline. And the big challenge was that there were very few people that were eligible to use those treatments, at least in the drug-resistant TB space. And with the WHO guidance, with the clinical trials that MSF, TB Alliance, and others ran, it became very clear that BPAL and BPAL-M could have tremendous impact if deployed at scale, if everyone with multidrug-resistant TB had access to these regimens. So the WHO recommendation, as we heard, makes BPAL-M the recommended treatment regimen for most MDR and RR-TB patients, not all. And we think the impact could be huge if they had access to this regimen. So the TB Practical study showed that 89% of patients were successfully treated with these regimens versus about 52% people receiving standard of care regimens. And so all of this together means that rather than 4,000 people a year being eligible to receive these regimens, we're talking about hundreds of thousands and potentially a significant impact on mortality. That said, when we talk to suppliers of the newer products, they said order volumes are still uncertain. We don't know how quickly programs will roll out. we don't have a lot of visibility into demand, and so pricing will remain high. So when we looked at how market shaping tools could potentially be helpful, we focused in on bedaquiline and protominid as the highest price products within the BPEL-M regimen, and specifically zeroed in on protominid to start, because in our discussions with suppliers, there was clear potential for something like guaranteed volumes over several years to potentially enable a price reduction. Although I would say there's still work to be done to improve competition for protominid and also on bedaquiline. So the agreement that we announced in December basically secured a 34% price reduction on protominid, which was, prior to this agreement, the most expensive component of the BPEL-M regimen. And that was achieved through a volume guarantee that MedAccess has provided to Viatris. In exchange, they're committing to a certain ceiling price over several years. That's $240 per patient course, and committing to registering the product in key markets. We're still talking about, how and when they can share that information more broadly. We've heard from civil society that it's quite important to be aware of registration status. We're also talking about what's possible in terms of production capacity scale up. So we're hopeful that this brings the overall price of the regimen down, comparable to the lowest price shorter treatment regimens that existed before the WHO guidance. We think there's potential for pricing to come down further, and hopefully for this regimen to reach, the hundreds of thousands of people that could benefit from it. And the hard work began before we even worked on this agreement. We know that governments, procurers like GDF, civil society have been advocating, pushing hard to think about introduction of BPEL-M, education, everything that needs to go into making this treatment regimen more widely available. And we look forward to continuing to work with all of those groups and all of you to hopefully significantly reduce mortality and morbidity due to drug-resistant TB. So thank you. Look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Hema. That was a really great talk. Covering an area that I think a lot of us are not very familiar with, and so really interesting to understand the process. And it leads in really nicely, because access to drugs and reduced pricing is only one aspect of implementation and making these regimens available to the places that need them. And so I think our next speaker flows quite well. And that is Ms. Ashna Shesh, who is a lawyer, a public health professional, and an MDR TB survivor associated with Survivors Against TB, or SATB, which is a community collective that works with TB survivors and diverse stakeholders to advocate for person and community-focused paradigms of care in TB in India. Ashna's work focuses on community engagement, TB and mental health, gender and TB, and diversity, equity, inclusivity in patient support and care. She's a member of the RGLC, Southeast Asia, WHO. She's also a member of the National Government Committee that reviews progress of the Indian National TB Program's National Technical Support Unit. Ashna is a widely published writer and a strong voice in TB advocacy, so very excited to welcome her to speak on integrated community engagement interventions in HIV/TB. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. You just need to bring up your slides.
Yes. Just a second. So.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you so much. So I'm going to be presenting on the integrated community engagement approaches in HIV and TB. I apologize, my throat's a little off, so if you can't hear me, please let me know. We're going to start with why we need this. What is the need for an integrated approach? Now, HIV and TB are comorbidities, and their integrated care has largely been mainstreamed in public health discourse and policy. I mean, we still have some ways to go, but largely we recognize that these are comorbidities and their management requires looking at both of them together, right? But community engagement for the two, while it happens in HIV and in TB, now it's starting in TB, it operates in silos largely. There's no integration there per se. There may be instances where people collaborate, but it's not yet a mainstream thing. So HIV's history of community engagement brings a lot of valuable lessons for TB. Persons living with HIV have been at the forefront of HIV advocacy, pushing through for better policies, better care, recognizing, bringing in legislation when it comes to anti-discrimination and equality, not just in terms of healthcare, but also access to housing, employment. So there are really many lessons that TB can take from this. And then while I don't need to take away from the gains that community engagement in TB has made, I think that integration would sort of help this cross-learning and sort of a collaborative approach to sort of better enhance community engagement. Now, person-centered HIV-TB care, again, requires engaging the persons affected by HIV and TB. So again, sort of collaborating here would help identify what kind of care would work for different sections of the affected community of persons living with HIV and TB. And of course, there's a need for diversity and inclusivity in not just HIV care, but also HIV-TB policy and services, and of course, healthcare. So what would it look like? And I know community engagement is a buzzword, and we tend to, it's becoming all the rage now, but there's very little clarity on what it actually entails. And at least from my context, I can tell you that it's not very community defined, and so there tend to be problems there because that consensus was not arrived at very collaboratively with communities co-creating that sort of definitional concept. So this is again broad strokes. I mean, this is not an exhaustive list, but broadly, what community engagement looks like is something that's co-led by communities. The shift you make here is that you're engaging with affected communities and communities in general as active stakeholders or care partners. They're not mere passive recipients of care. They're sort of equal partners with the clinician or the health system or the government in this care journey or in the journey of eliminating an infection or working towards managing comorbidities. Right? So that kind of shifts the focus from just giving them care to actually having them at the table where decisions are made about their lives, bringing in that sort of democratization and inclusivity in the process. This leads me to involving communities in design, planning, research, implementation of policy programs for HIV-TB care. So only when you have communities, affected communities from both infection areas in all of these stages, would you get something that would then be relevant to the on-ground realities? I mean, I'm going to take a very crude example. If a tailor is designing clothes, I mean, you take the measurement of the person you're designing it for. So when we design care or when we design healthcare policy or programs, why don't we account for the varied needs and the on-ground needs of affected communities? And who better to tell us about that than the communities themselves, right? And this would also sort of help empower communities to hold stakeholders accountable. As I said, we have made immense progress in community engagement. We're talking about it now. We're having more and more affected community members in events, in meetings, in committees. But there's this angle of accountability where beyond a point, there isn't much the affected community can do other than raise this issue. They're not really able to hold the relevant stakeholders accountable. And having those mechanisms in place is an equally important part of integrated community engagement for HIV and TB care. Now, how do we approach this? So I'm looking at this through two lenses. Both these lenses are conventionally applied to healthcare, so a rights-based approach to healthcare or a gender-responsive approach to healthcare. The rights-based approaches, of course, also apply to development, but I want to apply this to community engagement. And what would that mean and what would that look like? So let's start with the rights-based approach. At the heart of the rights-based approach, you've got participation, so involving affected communities from both HIV and TB. Then you've got equality and non-discrimination, ensuring that people have an equal opportunity to be able to, voice their opinion, advocate for the care they need or their communities need, ensuring that there isn't discrimination against any of the affected community members you're engaging, that all of them have equal opportunities, regardless of their gender, caste, class, ethnicity, religion, disability. And this is not an exhaustive list. Basically, none of these should be barriers to a community being able to engage to get the care it deserves, right? That's one. And third, I've come back to accountability, which is there have to be forums where community representatives can actually hold stakeholders accountable. And I do not mean this in a punitive way at all. Let's take the example of quality of care, right? So one way to go about this is to be very counterproductive and penalize people for making mistakes and just create this environment of fear where people are just afraid to report mistakes. Let's say a clinician is afraid to report it. But and we could learn here from the M&Ms that doctors have, where the point is not to berate somebody, but it is definitely to share knowledge and understand what happened, what went wrong, what you could do better, and creating more of those forums. So when I say accountability, I don't mean a blame game or a witch hunt. What I mean is creating forums where all stakeholders can come together in using this sort of multi-sectoral framework and look at what could have gone better, what went right, what can we do going forward. And the community needs to have an active role and this sort of the power to be able to hold those stakeholders accountable in that space. Because, I mean, a blame game is not really going to help or generate, it's not going to make someone more likely to fess up that, okay, this was an error or this is a shortcoming. So that has to be incentivized. Coming forward and talking about learnings and focusing on improving and optimizing our care policies, that needs to be incentivized. It shouldn't be a punitive or a penalty-based form of accountability. That's very important. Coming to the gender responsive approach, very often what happens is that, and although HIV and TB, or for that matter, any infection can happen to anybody, I want to make that very, very clear, especially because of the stigma around both HIV and TB, and then all the blame and shame that is put on persons affected by these diseases. It can happen to anybody, but here is the nuance. Marginalized communities are more affected, both at the preventive and curative stage, because of systemic marginalization. Not because of who they are, or not because of what they do, but because of the fact that marginalized communities, including the LGBTQI++ community, often does not have access to safe housing, stable income. At least where I come from, there tends to be discrimination in employment. So getting a stable income is difficult. You might work in the informal sector. Familial support tends to go out the window because heteronormativity is still quite strong. And people sort of discriminate just based on the identity itself. Let's not even get to if it's a person with HIV or TB. That's an added layer of stigma. So given all of these conditions, given that nutrition is often a problem, we actually worked with affected communities where we were trying to get an idea of what their experience has been. And we know of more than a few trans folks who told us how difficult it was to access nutrition during the COVID pandemic because of the red tape around, let's say, their birth name and what the preferred name now. So they were being dead named, and bureaucrats refused to give them the benefits they require, the documents they require to access those benefits. So a gender responsive approach would basically ensure that marginalized communities, and again, when I say LGBTQI++, I don't mean that they all have the same needs, but they do experience common factors of stigma and discrimination, both in communities and even in healthcare systems. And this is self-reported by them. So factoring in that marginalized identities, whether it's gender identities or sexual identities, need a seat at the table, so that these care policies are not designed by people exclusively who actually have no idea of the lived experience or the health needs or the socioeconomic needs of marginalized communities. It needs to be a good mix of, even within that affected community, there needs to be a good mix of various gender identities and sexual identities. And together, sort of these two as the underpinning, then we can sort of build on this and collaborate more effectively to improve care for us living with HIV and TB, and hopefully work towards eliminating these someday. Yeah, thank you so much. That's my time.
Thank you very much, Asna. That was, I mean, that was really interesting. And I think the issue that you've highlighted, that the TB world has a lot to learn from HIV. You know, HIV activists have had a lot of experience and have been very effective in making these changes. And we've got a lot to learn. I especially liked your statement that it's important to have the power to hold stakeholders accountable. And I also see there was a comment around that, which maybe we'll discuss later. So we're going to move into our final talk before we go into a Q&A session. And the next speaker is Wame Jallo. Wame joined PMC and has over 30 years of work in global health-related programming in the areas of HIV and AIDS, tuberculosis, hepatitis C, non-communicable diseases, sexual and reproductive health, community-led monitoring, OVC, maternal and child health, and nutrition, a huge portfolio. As a Vice President of International Programs at Population Media Center, Wame is responsible for the global portfolio. She spent her career listening, learning, monitoring, creating solutions with communities while moving public health and social movements forward along the way. And she'll be presenting on the whole society and innovative models to treating co-infections. Looking forward to it. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And just a slight correction that unfortunately is only 20 years. I'm not yet that experienced, but I'm definitely getting there. So thank you for my fellow panelists who actually made a presentation. I think a lot of the views that were shared resonate, and hopefully I'll be summarizing a lot of those points that were already highlighted. As PMC, we use this term whole society approach just to encompass like what a community response looks like in its totality. We also use the social behavioral change communication lens to improve and promote health-seeking behaviors, but also informed choice as well. So that is a lens that I will be sharing with this presentation, given that my colleague Ashana also presented it from a human rights perspective. So I think the overarching mission that we want to do is create a sustained change over time, and really enabling communities to be actively engaged and at the forefront of not only just the design, but also, you know, thinking through what are the changes that need to be made from a societal point of view. So a lot of our work as PMC is around creating radio shows, creating TV shows that help promote social change. So it's not just about the individual person, it's also looking at how we can create an enabling environment around the individual so that as they're going through the journey of treatment and care, they have the right requisite support around them. So part of the work that we do is to really try and promote social norms change, and this is behavior, as I've said, not just at an individual level, but also as a community, and that sort of helps bring communities together, that helps bring collaborative responses, that helps reinforce adherence support for many of the recipients of care. And ultimately, what we're trying to drive along in a bigger scale is increased and sustained demand for the right type of services, the right type of treatment, the right type of information that informs choices around care. To do this, we have to be able to understand the communities that we're working in. So a lot of the work starts with a lot of research. So in order for us to create a sustained norms change, we need to be able to understand what is the context for the communities or the individuals, and then be able to actually tell the stories of what that looks like. What does a good adherence process look like? What are the needs of the community? What does that look like? How do we package this information in a way that is more accessible and receptive to the audiences that we want? And then being able to demonstrate some of the challenges, but also some of the successes in treatment approaches, and how we can actually mobilize dialogue in order to have this sustained approach to improve healthcare over time. Here's a spectrum of communications, and There are many arrays of tools that can be used and approaches that can be used for communication. But ultimately, I think as PMC, we realized that if you really want to have a community, sustained community behavior change that's long lasting, having long-running CO dramas, long-running opportunities for community engagement, information is really core to the social behavior change mechanism that you would desire to see achieved. And we've seen really great results in having that very focused lens. For example, in Senegal, we did a radio broadcast and it was called Winds of Hope. And we were able to see post-evaluation of the radio slow drama, a change in knowledge and information. So we realized that 63% were less likely to believe that tuberculosis can be transmitted through sharing of utensils. And this was compared to the non-listeners about the understanding of how the disease spread. Same thing happened in the Philippines. We're able to see the difference when we intervene with knowledge and information and engagement at community level, that there was a shift in understanding of even the information, what it took to actually access services, but also knowledge about the actual treatment regimens, adherence issues, etc. And it created a safe space for communities to engage on the areas that they lacked information. So there are some ingredients that I want to just reinforce. I think Ashna raised some of these, and I think it's important to just think about it as we're thinking about the community engagement component. One is how we convene communities. When we convene communities to be able to share information, to bridge the knowledge gap. So you have empowered recipients of care who are able to sit in front of healthcare workers and have a dialogue about what does the optimal treatment actually look like. Having had the broadcast at a national level, or at least through radios, you're able then to have listener groups in a small, intimate setting with communities to engage on some of the information and knowledge that they've been able to gain, and also create feedback mechanisms in terms of what they're seeing on the ground. This is very important because when you look at it from a choice-centered approach, there are ways to empower the community to be as equal members in the conversation around improved care. So being able to share feedback around availability of services or availability of medicine, accessibility issues, whether it's affordable to them, the quality issues. Many times, even though we set up the healthcare service in a certain way, it's not always accessible to communities. It's not always the commodities or medicines services are not always available to meet the needs of communities. So this sort of dialogue and community feedback mechanism, as Ashna has said, not only does it bring help with accountability mechanisms, but it also helps to reinforce a framework to which we can continuously improve service delivery and hone it into the needs of the communities. There's a really excellent set of tools on community-led monitoring. This was done as called One Impact, community-led monitoring framework. It was done by Stop TB Partnership and ITPC. And it really is a great tool that you can give to communities to continuously monitor how efficient and effective some of the service delivery is, but also influence policy at a national level for the changes that need to be made to ensure greater equity in access. It's an app and it's available for people affected by TB. It provides information as well, especially issues around rights, support services, but also helps to connect people in a community space virtually on issues and challenges that they face. There's also a first responder dashboard that allows to collate the information, at least at a national level, and be able to track what is happening. And then there's an accountability dashboard as well that helps with the advocacy aspects of it and monitoring how well we're actually implementing our TB programs and also indicators for action and change. There's a final thought around this as well, is thinking very differently around how we're providing services. So it's one thing to have these services available. It's another thing to really think about what the community needs are and meeting them at that point. A lot of times we see there's a misalignment and that also hinders the ability to have great health outcomes. So these are some of the ingredients that that really pull together this whole society approach. It's not just about the individual; it's also thinking about how the community is responsive to managing care, to be participatory in the TB response, and to also provide contribution on how we can improve it going forward. So with that, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Wame. Fantastic work and a huge amount of work. And it just always amazes me, how much needs to go into these processes to try and make an impact. So thank you. And I think complements the other talks really well. So that wraps up the presentation part of this webinar. And I think everyone will agree they were outstanding presentations, very informative. And now we have about 20 odd minutes for Q&A. And I already see there's been a lot of engagement in the Q&A box, and the speakers have also been responding. So that's fantastic. Thank you. I've kind of been going through them and selecting which ones I think we should highlight for discussion. And I've selected one to kind of kick us off, which I think all speakers could potentially contribute to, or in fact, all speakers should contribute to. And this is a question from Chimwemwe Piri. And I'll just read out the question. Fuad's already responded, but I'd like Fuad also to kind of speak about this along with the other presenters. So the question is, we see most of these studies happening in developing third world countries. Once the recommendations from the studies have been adopted, it takes a great deal of time for the recommendations to be implemented in the third world countries. What is being done to bridge this gap? Fuad, maybe I'll start with you and then we can move on to everyone else.
Thank you, Sean. I think I typed the answer in a very brief one, but of course that deserves a wider discussion. It is true that it takes time for the countries with the burden of TB and drug-resistant TB to adopt and start implementing the new recommendations, but we should also not underestimate the amount of work that countries require to do that, because they have to update the national policies. They need to allocate sufficient resources from overseas or domestically. If it is from overseas, if it is from the donors, they need to put down the applications, and then they need to amend the regulatory framework to allow these new medicines or regimens to be approved in the country, and eventually deal with all the procurement that are sometimes not really easy and straightforward, since there are some new medicines in this regimen. So of course that requires some time, and it's understandable. So that I wanted to highlight. But there are many partners and that are helping countries to make sure that they understand what is these new regimens and how to implement them, including us in WHO. That I think I mentioned in my reply that together with the regional offices, there are a series of the regional workshops that are being organized this year, specifically for that purpose, to gather the high burden countries and make sure that they understand all details related to both the underlying evidence and the operational implementation of this new regimen. There is WHO started the online regular discussion platform, the so-called BPAL-M Accelerator platform that happens every month, and different topics are discussed. And just to finish that, we have also released on World TB Day the call to action that is focused on the use and implementation of this new 6-month regimen. I'll stop here. Maybe others want to complement.
Thanks very much. I'll just go down the list. Hema, do you have anything to add to this issue? I'm sure you do.
I think it was a great summary, Fuad. I guess the only thing I would add is just, on the procurement side of things, because I saw a few related questions coming up on just how governments can get access to BPAL-M, what support exists. So in addition to all the resources Fuad mentioned, I think there are international NGOs, local NGOs that are quite engaged on this topic. We work quite closely with Stop TB Partnership TB Alliance, CHAI, groups like that in a number of countries that are quite focused on supporting product introduction, transitions, especially in the drug-resistant TB space. And on the procurement side, the Global Drug Facility has been working for many months to make BPL-M broadly accessible, and they can often collaborate directly with governments to provide a procurement channel. And they have also started to create a strategic stockpile, which goes to another question I saw in the Q&A, just to make sure, since this is a lower volume product than, for example, treatments for drug-sensitive TB, and because there are a number of newer products that are supplied by only a single manufacturer, just to make sure there is consistent supply. I think GDF has some really interesting solutions there as well.
Thank you. Mohamed, yeah, I mean, do you have anything to add to this discussion about implementation considerations?
Oh, I see Ashna was jumping in, so maybe
Sorry.
I can go.
Please go ahead, please go ahead. I'll go after you, no worries.
Okay, no, nothing on my side as yet, but thank you.
Ashna, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. So I think, at least in the Indian context, a couple of problems that exist are, one is of evergreening. So we've seen this with bedaquiline, where there has been this constant sort of bid to not allow for compulsory licensing to come in and generic manufacturers to be able to make it. And that is also one of the reasons for delay. I mean, of course, the updates to policy and then that coming in, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar, but India has this concept of a phase lag in its clinical trial regulations, because what was happening before this is that it was really easy through contract research organizations to do trials here, because people living below poverty line would sign up for 5 like cocktail drug trials in the same day because they'd get incentives for it. And to sort of prevent that kind of exploitation, this phase lag came in, where this has to happen first in a high-income country, and then it can happen here. So those kind of things, of course, do take time. And there's a lot being done to increase access. But I think where it would really help is, one, political will, right? The governments can actually ask and instruct that compulsory licensing be brought in. Patenting laws allow for that. This is not to sort of stymie innovation, but innovation needs to be balanced with access. The reason we're innovating all of this is to provide more access. And from the community perspective, what I can tell you is that it boils down to this: while we've announced all oral regimens, they're still not available everywhere. And as somebody who had to take injectables for 6 months of my 2-year treatment, by the end of it, we almost ran out of places to inject me. We were looking at putting an IV hep lock in my femoral vein because we couldn't find any other place. And this only worked because I'm somebody who works in public health law and policy. So I worked with my doctor to rotate sites, and even then it wasn't enough. So that's what you're looking at. You add a pandemic to it. You have somebody who has to go 20 kilometers just to get that injection. Those facilities are not easily available in all parts of India. So bringing in that kind of access is incredibly important. And of course, the community needs to keep advocating for it. People who've been affected need to talk about it. But governments and international organizations also need to step in, because regardless of how, maybe the demand for this is not as much as the drug-sensitive TB drugs, maybe it's a selective cohort, but it has to be people over profits. The reason we make medicines is to save people, not to line pharmaceutical pockets. So yeah, that's just my 2 cents. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that personal story that you just told, I think just makes the strongest argument out of anything that anyone has said, right? And if you can get that message across that this actually is people and, improves people's lives, that's critical. I guess related to this, and I was wondering if this is a slight barrier to implementation, and there was a question around this as well from Ilaria Mota. Hi, Ilaria, if you're still here. And I guess I'll ask it to Fuad, but I mean, also I'm interested in other people's responses around this. Fuad, you spoke about and you showed that the recommendation for these 6-month regimens for BPL-M are conditional recommendations. And that's because the quality of the evidence is not very strong. Do you think that impacts on implementation? And, when countries see a conditional recommendation, do you think that makes them reluctant? And how do we move forward to making this a stronger recommendation?
Well, thank you, Ilaria and Sean, for this question. It's in this format. It's very complex question, difficult to answer it with one couple of sentences. But what we have, and TB practical, that was finally in TB we don't have many of the good quality trials. That was a randomized controlled trial, so that was a big advantage. But at the same time, this was done in 3 countries, so it's not like globally representative, and it's still 100 or couple of hundred of patients. And when you start digging down and looking at different combinations and comparing that, that ends up with a very numerically and statistically less certain evidence. And you know, the guidelines group that WHO convenes and using this very standardized process called GRADE process for development of recommendations. And it's very complex, many different aspects that are being looked at. But when you look at the desirable and benefits and undesirable consequences, it's still, when you have the smaller numbers, it is very difficult to come up with the high certainty of evidence, and it's being downgraded in the process. So you know, it doesn't give justice to the whole process to try and describe that in a few words, but that's what essentially happens. So so what we need in TB, we need more good quality trials, better quality of data, and probably have the trials with a bigger number of participants and done in many countries, so it's kind of easily can be translated in the policy that is global.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that was a great answer. And I think it's really important for the audience to kind of get an insight into the process and how these recommendations are made. And also just to pick up on what Ashna was saying earlier about difficulty of doing clinical trials in India. You know, we need trials in diverse populations that are affected by this, and that's very important. So I wanted to ask a question, and this has come up in different forms in the chat as well, to specifically Wame and Ashna. And that is, you know, what would you say, you know, based on your experience and the tools that are available, that are the specific activities that you could kind of recommend to national TB programs to support implementation of these shorter regimens, you know, especially in the context of HIV?
Thanks. I can take a first stab at that. Yeah, great question. And I think it also ties in with, you know, how to see some of those recommendations filter down at national level, and also increase greater community participation. I mean, I think the starting point is to make sure that we're really building the knowledge of communities. I think that's a really important part of it, so that, you know, you don't have an isolation of communities just being on the receiving side of the services. It needs to be a concerted effort from the very beginning. What are the values and preferences from a recipient of care point of view? And then how do you work with the communities throughout the process? I think that has been the mistake we've made, is engaging it at the end point. And then being able to feedback, create processes to feedback, you know, this is what's happening through the provision of care. This is what how it impacts me or the communities from that point of view, and that way we keep refining the process. So I think it's and I'm thank you, Abdel, for that question around how do you increase community participation. We create forums, but we create forums and we create room space around the table for communities to be able to give that feedback and collect data. Community-led monitoring tools are very effective in being able to break down from a user perspective, you know, how's the quality of care? How does it, what does it look like from a policy perspective? What does it look like from a supply chain perspective? How does it, how are the regimens actually working with, you know, helping to improve my health outcomes? Do we need to think about it from a different perspective in terms of the type of care and processes around it? So there needs to be a more deliberate engagement of communities from the very onset. And I think that's through education. If you have empowered communities, they'll be able to give feedback on what's working and not working. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Ashna, did you have anything to add about practical suggestions?
Yeah, so in terms of shorter regimens, I think one of the important things is to do a forecasting exercise, because given the times we live in, with the pandemic, what happened, we saw even with the existing regimens, was that there was a supply shortage, there was a procurement problem. So sort of doing that forecasting and keeping buffer stocks in place is, I'm so sorry about, okay. Apologies. So yeah, that's one, to ensure that there's an availability beyond just maybe 1 year or 2 years when these things come in. And apparently honking powered vehicles. So sorry about that. Yes, I live near the highway, but okay. And another thing is also building awareness, right? So demand generation for these regimens will only come in when community capacity is actually built. And we are aware of these shorter regimens, and that means speaking in a language that is accessible to communities and stepping out of it. And lawyers, as lawyers, we're famously bad at this. Legalese is meant for nobody to understand. But even with clinical jargon, right, we need to sort of simplify it and make sure the communities understand what the regimens are, so that they can actually advocate for this at different levels. Creating sort of these forums where communities can actually identify where is the most pressing need, because let's assume we want universal access and that is the end goal, but in limited resource settings, that does not happen, practically speaking. So all these prevalence surveys that we're doing, using that data to actually map where do we want to come in, and where do we want to start off with making those shorter regimens available, and in a phased manner, making it available all across the country. So these are a couple of things I could think of in addition to Rami's points.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I mean, I was just reflecting as you were both speaking. I mean, I don't know if kind of documents exist with these sorts of things written down that, you know, could be shared with, you know, the people that need to implement these things. I mean, I think that would be very helpful. I imagine they do, because yeah, I've found this helpful. So I see here that there's a question for Hema, and I don't know if you've seen this. It's from Pratyasha Rath, and this is the question: would you consider user behavior shaping as part of market preparation shaping? Preventive health mindsets are in general a very steep behavioral barrier and could play a major role in latent TB products. Is there any kind of user market behavioral segmentation that could help in the market shaping efforts? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. That sounds like a good topic for a PhD thesis. So I'm not sure I'm intellectually at the level to be able to answer it. But yeah, it's a really, really important point across different products. So these market shaping tools have been used from vaccines to preventive treatments to diagnostics to treatments like protominid. And in some of those areas, behavior change and thinking about consumer preferences is really, really important. And generally speaking, what we do is partner with organizations, community organizations, demand generation organizations that specialize in that aspect of the effort. So it really does kind of underscore the partnership and collaboration that underpins market shaping. Organizations like MedAccess are really good at putting together the agreements, the financing tools, but we're definitely not experts in terms of behavior change. So we rely pretty heavily on civil society partners, NGO partners, governments to help fill in the gaps. Unfortunately, what that means is when we try to bridge into areas that don't have that level of support and funding, it becomes really challenging to put together comprehensive solutions that actually can reach the individuals that can benefit from treatment. So it's just really important at the outset to make sure that we've accounted for initiatives that can help with changing behaviors, supporting providers, supporting patients, and getting access to products.
Thank you. So there were quite a few clinical questions, and there were at the beginning some questions about the need for resistance testing. And so, you know, having systems, resources in place to test for fluoroquinolone resistance in order to support the implementation of these regimens. Fuad, you responded to some, but I thought it was important to just kind of raise this and, you know, have you kind of speak about it. And then the kind of second part I want to ask you is the role in the future of pan-TB regimens. So, I mean, maybe let me just ask you, and I think others can also comment on this. Let me just ask you to just clarify the role of fluoroquinolone resistance testing in the context of the BPEL-M regimens, and you know what sorts of diagnostics, at least DST, we need in order to support the implementation.
Yeah, no, there were a couple of good questions about the pan-TB, about the testing that is needed and whether this testing should be absolutely ideally done before the treatment starts. And I was answering different questions, and it's true. I mean, it's good. I mean, it is ideal, and in the modern world where we have all these rapid tests, it is better to have the DST to be done to all TB patients before the treatment. But unfortunately, this is not the reality everywhere. And we have to be kind of really trying to push the availability of these new diagnostics. And I think there was a question asking about the, actually, I agree with the person that, you know, the availability of diagnostics can seriously limit the benefits of this treatment, since if you don't find these patients, you cannot use these good and nice new regimens for them. So it is a major limitation factor. But at the same time, doing the DST, and especially in the context of the BPAL-M, BPAL regimen, what we see from the evidence that both BPAL-M and BPAL, they do work and have a high efficacy. So as compromise that, and of course, you don't want to keep the moxi, the quinolone, in the regimen if someone has the resistance. So it will just cause some additional adverse events, possibly some accumulate the QT prolongation, etc. So you want to eliminate this and keep the drugs that are effective only. So, but at the same time, if you put that obligatory test, you make that a requirement before starting that treatment, while you know that the patients will still be cured, it then limit the use of the regimen. So we have to find the compromise. That's why we say what we say in this recommendation, that someone can start with the BPAL-M if DST for quinolones is not yet available, but it is imperative to do that and adjust the treatment, either keep moxi or take it out from the regimen and continue treating the patients. When it comes to the pan-TB regimens, it is true, it can be a great solution to avoiding any DST, because you have a priori the regimen that can be used for any patient, because it has all the new drugs. There is no the possibility of having the resistance to these medicines. But it is an ideal that we still need to wait and see in practical terms that it is we know that there are partnership, the big also funders that are leveraging into this development, but it's still at the early stages. And whether the pan-TB regimens can be a regimen that can really used in the places where DST is not available, so it will be a niche type of regimen, or it can be the regimen that can be used for everyone, we are yet to see. It really depends a lot on the characteristics of the regimen, its cost, the adverse events it's causing, and many other factors that I don't think we have time to cover during this session. But if people are interested in that, we are working on the update of the target regimen profiles for drug-susceptible TB, rifampicin-resistant TB, and pan-TB regimens that will be released in a couple of months by WHO. And that will have a lot more thinking and considerations on this, on the pan-TB regimen.
Thank you very much. I think that was helpful. So we are running out of time. And what I'm going to then, I mean, there's many more questions that we could go through, and this has just been such a vibrant discussion. I'm just going to ask each of the panelists before we wrap up, just to maybe give a 30-second final comment. So Fuad, I'll start with you, and then I'll just go down the list in the order of how you've spoken.
Thank you very much, Sean. I maybe just to say thank you for all these questions that many participants. I'm glad to see that, and just to say that we are entering this year into very new era, I think, with the treatment of drug-resistant TB, and I hope that countries, the partners, will step up and make sure that these regimens are implemented, because that's a drastic, positively disruptive change for so many patients, decreasing the length of treatment that can really help to ease the load on the healthcare systems and make sure that more patients are being treated and, you know, really at the end affect the course of this pandemic.
Thank you. Emma?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Fuad said. I think there's a real opportunity here to make a significant difference in the lives of people who contract drug-resistant TB. And so we all need to keep this dialogue going, keep sharing questions and suggestions with each other, and stay connected to really realize that opportunity. And I think a lot of the comments raised in the questions and the chat are quite important. We have a lot of work to do to keep driving down the prices of these regimens, to make them much more widely available, to increase competition, to make diagnostics more accessible, more affordable. And so, yeah, fully recognize we're kind of at the start of what will be a long journey, but I hope we can continue this dialogue and achieve something really impactful together.
Thank you. Ashna?
Thank you. I think communities have been at the sidelines of this for quite a while now, and while we're working towards moving them to the center, having affected communities at the center is essential to an effective response. And also sort of recognizing them as equal partners, because we want to collaborate with you to do this. We don't want to stand on the sidelines and just be like, oh, nothing's being done. We actually want to get there in the trenches and then work with you towards TB elimination, HIV elimination. And one of the important aspects in that from a community perspective would be to also sort of train communities in advocacy, and community-led platforms such as ours do that. But another aspect is also looking at them as more than either persons living with HIV or TB survivors. Since a lot of us have, I mean, my example, for instance, I'm a lawyer and a public health professional. I work in public health law and policy. I happen to have survived TB. That's an important part of my identity, but that's not all I am. I bring other aspects that you could benefit from, like it's all in one place. So looking at survivors as survivors, of course, or persons living with HIV, definitely, but also looking at what else do they bring to the table and using that in the response, because there are enough of us out there and we have enough skills to help with this. So thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Wame, 10-second summary.
Okay, well, just to say thank you very much to everyone. And I think my panelists have said a lot, but I think at the core of it is information, education, data. We can't do this without having communities play a very active role in that. So with that, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. And from me as well, thank you to the panelists. Thank you to all to the entire audience. We had over 800 people, which is astonishing, and really great discussions and interaction. And so I'm going to hand back over to Kenneth to wrap up.
Thank you, Sin. That was great. We thank the excellent speakers and each of the 800 attendees for participating in this webinar. I'm hopeful that you have found this webinar enlightening and enjoyable, as I have. You'll be automatically requested to fill out an evaluation survey as you leave the webinar. Your feedback is important to IAS so that we can continue to improve our webinars for the future. The survey link will also be posted on the chat, and probably you've seen it by now. And thank you again for participating in this webinar, which has now come to an end. The recording will be available on the IAS website soon, and we encourage the participants to share broadly with their colleagues and networks. We wish you a nice morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are, and look forward to connecting and seeing you in future webinars soon. Thank you, and have a good one.